Tragedy and mystery have always surrounded the gruesome murder of the last imperial family of Russia, the Romanovs. It's why myths have turned into movies and plays, and in the case of the Crown series, TV. As more and more details have come out over the past century, the true account of what actually happened almost puts the fictional versions to shame. It all started with a very different Russia, a more autocratic Russia, even by today's standards. In 1900, Russia was one of the most powerful countries in the world. It was physically bigger than every other country. It was also one of the most recently enlightened. The Romanov czars that ruled it were a huge part of all of this. In a relatively short amount of time, they were able to extend its borders from what is now Finland all the way to North America. The czars had also spent over a century building schools, museums, a university, and they even imported art, theater, and philosophy from the more advanced countries in Europe. This was all known as the Enlightenment. Unfortunately for these czars, though, the empire wasn't as strong as they thought. In fact, by 1900, most of the country was suffering now more than ever. The reason for this was because the improvements the czars had been making were only improving the lives of the rich. Most people didn't benefit in any way from the Enlightenment, or schools, or any of the fancy museums. In fact, most people weren't educated at all. They were illiterate. Peasants, farmers, and factory workers made up 85% of the population, and they just weren't given the same opportunities as the rich. In fact, they were miserable. But they were doing all the work and essentially holding up the country with their agricultural exports and cheap labor. The peasants were poor, they couldn't find work. The farmers couldn't meet production demands nor pay their taxes. And working in one of these so-called modern factories wasn't a way out from any of that. Workers found themselves working 16 hours a day in dangerous conditions. Life was tough for the average Russian. This is what Nicholas inherited when he became Tsar. He was not the right man for the job. For starters, he was young. He was 26. A 26-year-old that instead of being educated on how to rule, was sent on a world tour with some of his cousins. The only thing he had to show for that tour was a badass dragon tattoo on his forearm he got in Japan. When his father died unexpectedly, he found himself in a very uncomfortable position. Nicholas was now the Tsar, the supreme ruler of all of Russia. This was something he just wasn't interested in nor equipped for. He even said, "I'm not ready to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing about the business of ruling." From the beginning, things didn't go right. The day after his coronation, tragedy struck. At a public event, food and drink was to be handed out to the people. This turned out to be a bad idea. The peasants were starving, and they were afraid supplies would run out. This caused them to rush the food stands, resulting in a stampede. Over 1,000 people died. Instead of mourning the dead, Nicholas attended a party in honor of the French ambassador. It made him look like he couldn't care less about anyone's suffering. All people saw was the Tsar off partying while people were dying. It's ironic because he had actually preferred to stay home and pray for the dead. The only reason he went to the party was for diplomatic reasons. His uncles had advised him to go in order to maintain good relations between France and Russia. This reputation as an uncaring leader stuck with him. Over the next decade, Nicholas wasn't exactly a hands-on ruler. He made no improvements. The peasants and workers were starting to get desperate. In 1905, a group of factory workers took action. They decided to write a letter and bring it to the palace themselves, hoping to give it to the Tsar. Since they didn't know how to write, they got help from a priest. Letter in hand, accompanied by the priest, they approached the palace. And they weren't an angry mob. They were actually still very loyal to the Tsar. They just wanted to improve their lives working in the factory. They also wanted an end to the war taking place in Japan. They saw the war as unnecessary and a waste of resources. They thought, why put all the country's resources into an unnecessary war when we need them more? They really just wanted to end their suffering. The group locked arms and began their walk through the streets. The protest was peaceful. They carried religious icons, as well as portraits of the Tsar and national flags. They sang hymns and even chanted, "God save the Tsar." The group had grown, and more people began joining in throughout the city. So what happened next? The last thing anyone could have expected. The soldiers opened fire. Nicholas wasn't even at the palace, he was off somewhere else. He didn't even order the soldiers to shoot, but still all people saw was an attack on innocent Russians. In fact, not just the peaceful protesters were killed, but innocent bystanders as well. The reaction was swift. Word quickly got around about what had happened. Workers in all major cities went on strike. This decimated Russia's already weak economy. The Tsar had to act fast and get people back to work. He set up the Duma, Russia's first attempt at parliamentary government. It consisted of representatives from all levels of society. He needed to change the public's perception of him. But of course, this Duma was all for show. He made it so he would have ultimate vetoing power. Rarely did anything get passed. He was actually very much against giving away any of his power. Nicholas was determined to maintain autocratic rule. Nicholas even said when he became Tsar, "I want everyone to know that I will devote all my strength to maintain, for the good of the whole nation, the principle of absolute autocracy." So the Duma remained ineffective, and there's another decade of suffering. In 1914, a huge event happened that pushed Russia to its breaking point: World War I. The Tsar now had two major problems. Russia was fighting in World War I and doing poorly. In fact, millions of soldiers were dying. The country's resources were diverted to the war effort. And this meant that there was even less food to go around than before, and no railroads to transport the little food they had. At the same time the war was going on, the revolutionary movements were growing. The Bolsheviks who were leading these movements were gaining support from the peasants and factory workers. Everybody seemed to be getting excited about the idea of change. Since Nicholas was the absolute ruler, he had to be in two places at once. He needed to win the war, the country depended on it, and he had to fight back the revolutionaries. His solution to this was what eventually would seal his fate. Nicholas made himself commander-in-chief of the army. He left the capital and went to the war front. In his place, he left his wife in charge of government. Okay, Alexandra, his wife, the empress, was known to be emotional and stubborn and didn't get along with a lot of the ministers. So she relied mainly on the input of a man named Grigory Rasputin. Rasputin was a mystic healer who may or may not have healed her son's incessant bleeding. Alexandra grew to trust Rasputin and had begun to rely on him. It was no wonder that when she was left in charge, she would continue to go to him for advice. And the ministers didn't like this. Rasputin was a drunk and a womanizer, and for the most part didn't know what he was talking about. Alexandra would fire any ministers who gave pushback. She would then replace them with ministers who would just do what they were told, most of whom were incompetent. The government had enough of this. They had to get rid of Rasputin. They devised a plan. They knew he was a bit of a drunk, so they lured him to the home of a member of the Imperial family, offering him wine and food. They poisoned him with cakes. But that didn't work, so they gave him 3 poisoned glasses of wine. This still seemed to have no effect, so they finally just shot him. They originally thought he was dead, but as they approached him, he miraculously jumped up, still alive, so they had to shoot him again, finally finishing him off.
Oh, those Russians.
Rasputin's out of the picture, but it's too late. The situation in the capital had already deteriorated. Strikes had increased steadily over the previous year, and so did crime. People scoured the city for food, reportedly spending about 40 hours a week in food lines. It was winter, so people were freezing and had to build fires to keep warm. They'd break apart wooden fences or anything they could get their hands on in order to do this. At the same time this was all going on, Nicholas was off fighting the war. The German army had modernized in ways that the Russian army hadn't. Russia was being decimated, losing millions of soldiers. Everyone blamed Nicholas because he was commander-in-chief. In the eyes of the government, Nicholas and Alexandra were only making things worse. That brings us to March 1917, the beginning of the end. A group of both peasant women and society women led a march through the Russian capital. This coincided with International Women's Day. They chanted, "Please feed the children." The soldiers, who were mostly made up of peasants, put down their guns in support of their cause. More men and women joined the march and began to demand the end to autocracy. This day marked the beginning of the Russian Revolution. The capital is in a state of anarchy at this point. The government finally has to come up with a plan. The Tsar had left the war front by train and was headed back to the capital. He was intercepted and brought aside by an army general and deputies of the Duma. There, he was encouraged to abdicate. Originally, he abdicated in favor of his son, Alexei. Doctors then reminded the Tsar that Alexei had serious health issues and probably wouldn't have a long life. Nicholas ended up abdicating on behalf of himself as well as his son, leaving his brother, Mikhail, the new Tsar. Mikhail had no idea his brother was even abdicating. He just woke up one morning and was informed of this. He was also told that representatives of the provisional government were coming to meet with him. Over lunch, they came up with an agreement everyone was happy with. Mikhail would defer power to the Duma. At a later date, and only at the will of the people, would he accept the role of Tsar. As we all know, this never happened. 300 years of Romanov rule was over. The government's plan worked, and it immediately was met with a lot of support. People rejoiced in the capital. It was like a celebration. People were so overwhelmed with the prospect of change. The US was the first to recognize the newly formed provisional government, with both Britain and France following shortly after. Nicholas Romanov, as he was now referred to, was brought to Alexander Palace outside the capital. There, he was reunited with his family. The new government was concerned for the family's safety, so they had already moved the rest of the family away from the capital. The original idea was to exile them, but there were limited options. The French were like, nah, your wife's German and we're currently fighting the Germans, and Italy was out of the question. The Tsar would have had to go through the very areas he was just fighting a war with. So they approached Britain, which seemed like a promising option. This is where the crown storyline comes into play. George, the King of England, and Nicholas's mothers were sisters, which made the two men cousins. They even looked alike. They'd spent a lot of time together over the years. They'd visit each other often and would regularly bump into each other at family weddings. Since George was fond of Nicky, as he called him, he initially agreed to help. He considered sending a Navy cruiser to pick up the Imperial family. The Russian provisional government was even fine with this. For a moment, it looked like Nicholas and his family would be saved. George, though, ended up pulling a 180. He grew concerned with the backlash he'd get from his own people. Britons were not a fan of the Tsar. They even nicknamed him Nicholas the Bloody after the Bloody Massacre in 1905. George felt like he had no choice but to rescind his offer. So the Imperial family stayed at Alexander Palace. And at first, it wasn't a bad setup, even though they were under house arrest. In fact, during this time, the Romanovs lived like a regular family. While Alexandra and her daughters would sew, Nicholas was in the backyard chopping wood. They'd go for walks together, along with the guards, of course, and even shoveled out paths in the snow. When it got warmer, they'd work in the garden. By the summer of 1917, things began to change. The Red Army, the Bolsheviks, were slowly advancing. Being under house arrest by the provisional government was one thing. Falling into the hands of the revolutionaries would be much worse. The provisional government, who was watching over the family, was concerned as well. They had to get the family out of there. In August, they quietly moved them to Serbia, where they continued their house arrest in the governor's mansion. They were still under house arrest, but it wasn't all that unpleasant. Finally, in November 1917, the Bolsheviks officially seized power from the provisional government. Over the next 6 months, conditions rapidly deteriorated for the family. Nicholas was officially stripped of his military ornaments, and many of the servants were dismissed. The soldiers keeping an eye on the family were gradually replaced with Bolshevik soldiers. These revolutionaries were intimidating and frightened the children. It was also finally decided that Nicholas would be brought to trial. In April 1918, the family was moved to Ipatiev House, the home of a military officer. Here they were held in close quarters. A fence was built around the house to enclose the family. And when the fence didn't seem good enough, the soldiers built a wall. Windows were covered and air ducts were blocked. The situation became incredibly claustrophobic. The guards would regularly drink, smoke, and sing revolutionary songs loudly in the room next to the family. The soldiers would also scrawl lewd things on the wall outside the window where the family could see them. This was to intimidate them. With the White Army approaching, the officers started to panic. The White Army consisted of monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism. The Red Army, the Bolshevik revolutionaries, didn't want the Tsar to fall into the hands of anyone who could possibly sympathize with him. They had to act fast. This is where things started to get bloody. Any member of the imperial family still in the area was executed, including Nicholas's brother Mikhail. The family had no idea this is what was going on. In the early morning of July 17, 1918, the imperial family was woken. They were informed they would be moving again. The family was hopeful. They quickly gathered their belongings. Their few remaining servants and doctor packed as well, and the group left their tiny prison for the last time. They descended the stairs of the house, but instead of leaving, were led to the basement. They were confused. When they questioned why they were there, they were informed a photo was to be taken of all of them to quell any rumors the family had escaped. They were given 2 chairs, one for the former empress and one for the son, and they were told to wait. Finally, a group of Bolshevik soldiers entered. Nicholas was then told, in view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. Nicholas fearfully responded, "What?" The men raised their guns and fired. With the first shots, Nicholas was killed instantly. As the soldiers continued to fire, the room filled with smoke and screams of the terrified family, making for a very chaotic situation. A soldier ran outside to see how loud the gunfire was from the road and noticed many of the neighbors were beginning to wake up. He quickly returned to the basement and told the men to stop firing. When the smoke cleared, the men realized that none of the children were dead. In fact, only one had been actually hit. By this point, a few of the daughters and servants were crouched by the wall, crying and praying, terrified for their lives. Alexei, the son, was surprisingly still sitting in his chair. The men were ordered to use their bayonets instead of making more noise with their guns. The soldiers complied. When this failed, they resorted back to their guns. This time, though, they were told to shoot the victims directly in the head. Finally, the moans began to die down, and the victims lay still. What was supposed to be a quick execution lasted over 20 minutes. Most of the men weren't trained soldiers. In fact, many were rumored to be random thugs that had been rounded up to just get the job done. Regardless, they were all drunk, and their aim was completely off. The soldiers were also not aware that the family had sewn their jewels into their clothes, having done this to hide what valuable items they had left from the soldiers. The hidden jewelry protected the family, with the bullets even ricocheting back at the soldiers themselves. Between this, the lack of following instructions, drunken aiming, and poor planning, it was a mess. A totally botched job. And it only got worse from there. The soldiers now had to get rid of the bodies, or more like hide the bodies. If news got out that the family had been murdered, there could have been retaliation from the Russian people over the murders of the innocent children. The soldiers had previously chosen a mine to bury the bodies in. They just had to get them there. They loaded the truck with the dead, but were delayed a bit when they spent time checking the bodies for more hidden jewels. When they finally got going, the truck got stuck in the mud. They eventually made it to the mine, but quickly realized it wasn't going to be big enough to fit all the bodies. They had to dig an extra grave nearby for 2 of the bodies. And since they only had 1 shovel, this took a while. They then used acid to attempt to break down the bodies, then waited. Not much happened. They decided to douse the bodies with gasoline and burn them, and this helped a little. They then used the shovel to finish breaking down the ashes, but were still left with skeletal remains, which they really couldn't do anything about. Throughout this whole process, they didn't have much of what they needed. They ended up having to make separate trips back to town to retrieve it all. What was meant to be a quick process ended up taking over 2 days. The burial was finally completed at 6 a.m. on July 19th. A few days later, it was announced in the capital that Nicholas the Bloody had been executed. The public wasn't informed about the rest of the family until later. The Romanovs weren't the only ones to meet this kind of fate. 11 more members of the imperial family were killed by the Bolsheviks in similar fashion. The rest of the family who lived escaped to relatives in Western Europe and the US, including Nicholas's mother, who made her way to Denmark. There was one survivor from that evening, a spaniel named Joy that belonged to Alexei, the Tsar's son. Joy ran from the house, spooked by the sounds of the gunshots. He eventually returned and was taken care of by a Bolshevik officer. After the soldiers left, a British colonel ended up finding Joy inside the house, alone and frightened. He was brought to one of Empress Alexandra's former ladies-in-waiting who identified the dog. Or more like, the dog identified the woman. Joy was so excited to see her, he jumped up and down ecstatically, apparently remembering her smell. He was then brought by the colonel onto a British ship. Unlike his master, Alexei, Joy did finally escape Russia, where he spent the rest of his days in Windsor, England. The bodies of the imperial family would remain buried for the next 60 years. Finally, in 1979, an amateur archaeologist and a filmmaker had heard rumors of the graves' whereabouts and set about to find them. They ended up finding bone fragments, but were afraid to bring it to anyone's attention. Remember, this is Soviet Russia, and anti-imperial sentiments were still high. Fearing retribution for finding them, they just reburied them in the same spot where they found them. And that's where they remained for another 10 years. One of the men finally brought it to the attention of the authorities in the late 80s, when the government had loosened its stance on discussing the imperial family. The Russians finally exhumed the bodies and began the process of identifying them. This is where the Crown storyline kicks back in, but it happened a little differently than what was portrayed. In the 90s, DNA testing became possible. The bodies were tested with the DNA of the extended family of the Romanovs, but it wasn't until around 2010 that Prince Philip played his part in it. The bodies of the son and one of the daughters were found in 2007. It was here that Philip's DNA was used to properly identify the two remaining members of the imperial family. Most of the family was finally given a proper burial on July 17, 1998, exactly 80 years after the execution. The Russian government put the remains in St. Peter and Paul Cathedral, home to all Romanov remains. Romanov remains are considered to be sacred relics. The Russians used this moment to reconcile with its past. The Romanovs, minus the two missing children, were finally able to find a proper place of rest. The two found in 2007 are still, to this day, waiting for their proper burial. Back in 2000, all 6 members of the family were created saints of the Russian Orthodox Church for their humbleness, meekness, and patience during their imprisonment by the Bolsheviks. There's a lot of information out there about all of this, so check it out. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel for more videos like this.